At my son's house for Christmas, I found a note taped to my daughter-in-law's stepfather's wheelchair. They'd gone to Italy. They left him for me to care for. I stared in shock, but he looked up, his voice strong, and pulled out a recorder. "Now I have a witness," he said. What I heard next made my blood run cold. "Follow my story until the end and tell me which city you're listening from." The festive lights of my son Ethan's neighborhood twinkled against the early winter twilight, casting a magical glow over the freshly fallen snow. It was December 23rd, and my heart was full of anticipation. This was supposed to be our first big Christmas together since Chloe's mother had passed away, a time to heal and create new memories. I had baked my signature gingerbread cookies, their spicy scent still clinging to my coat, and carried a small bag of thoughtfully chosen presents. I pictured the scene inside, a crackling fire, the scent of pine from their magnificent tree, and the warm embraces of my son and his wife. But as I walked up the stone path, an unsettling quiet seemed to seep from the house itself. No music drifted from the windows. No lights flickered inside, except for the stoic glow of the Christmas tree. I rang the doorbell, its cheerful chime echoing into the silence. I waited, shifting my weight from one foot to the other, the cold beginning to nip at my cheeks. I rang it again. Nothing. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. Finally, I tried the doorknob. It turned. The door swung open into a silent, still foyer. This was the first alarm bell. My daughter-in-law, Chloe, was meticulous to a fault. She would never leave the door unlocked. "Ethan? Chloe?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the cavernous entryway. The only response was the gentle hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. I stepped inside, setting my bags down and closing the door behind me. The house was immaculate, as always, but it felt sterile, devoid of the warmth and life I had been so eagerly anticipating. The grand Christmas tree stood in the corner of the living room, beautifully decorated but unlit, its ornaments like sleeping jewels in the dim light. And then I saw him. Sitting in his wheelchair, positioned to face the cold, dark fireplace, was Chloe's stepfather, Arthur. His back was mostly to me, a plaid blanket draped over his lap. My heart softened with a mix of pity and confusion. Arthur had suffered a debilitating stroke a few years back that left him largely non-communicative and dependent on others. Why was he all alone in the dark? "Arthur," I said gently, walking toward him, "where is everyone?" He didn't turn or respond. As I drew closer, I noticed a piece of white paper taped to the armrest of his wheelchair. My eyes scanned the looping, elegant handwriting I recognized instantly as Chloe's. The words felt like a slap in the face. "We decided to take a last-minute trip to Italy for Christmas. It was a deal we just couldn't pass up. Arthur needs looking after while we're gone. His meals are in the fridge, and his medication schedule is on the counter. We'll be back after New Year's, Chloe." The air rushed out of my lungs. Italy. They had gone to Italy. They had left this vulnerable man alone in a dark house, waiting for me to arrive and discover their abandonment. It wasn't just about Arthur either. They had known I was coming. They had let me bake and pack and drive 2 hours in holiday traffic, all while knowing they wouldn't even be here. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. I looked from the note to the still figure in the wheelchair, a wave of hot anger washing over my initial shock. Just as I was about to crumple the note in my fist, a voice cut through the silence. It was clear, steady, and utterly unexpected. "Hello, Eleanor." I gasped and stared at Arthur. He had swiveled his head to look at me, and his eyes were not vacant or confused as I had always known them to be. They were sharp, intelligent, and held a glint of something I couldn't quite place. "I was wondering when you'd arrive," he said, his voice stronger than I had ever heard it. Stunned into silence, I could only hold up the note. He nodded toward it. I know what it says. Chloe read it to me before they left. Or rather, she read it at me. There's a difference." He gave a short, dry scoff. "Oh, they left me here. All right, but not the way you think." He paused, his gaze piercing. "Tell me, Eleanor, in all the time you've known her, have you ever heard Chloe speak to me? Or is it always as if I'm a piece of furniture that needs to be dusted and fed?" His words resonated with a painful truth. I had noticed her condescending tone, the way she spoke about him in the third person even when he was in the room. I had chalked it up to the stress of being a caregiver, but now, hearing it from his perspective, it felt different. It felt like a deliberate erasure of his humanity. Before I could answer, he leaned forward slightly, his expression hardening. Your son and his wife didn't go to Italy for a romantic Christmas getaway. My brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? He slowly raised his left hand from beneath the blanket. Clutched in his fingers was a small, black digital recording device. A tiny red light was blinking rhythmically, indicating it was active. He looked at me with eyes that held no trace of confusion or frailty, only a grim, unwavering resolve. He looked at me because now I have a witness. I followed Arthur into the kitchen, my mind reeling. I watched, dumbfounded, as he wheeled himself to the counter, reached up with a surprising lack of effort, and retrieved 2 mugs from the cabinet. His hands, which I had only ever seen resting limply in his lap or shaking slightly as Chloe spoon-fed him, were perfectly steady. He filled a kettle with water, his movements economical and precise, and set it on the stove. Every action was a direct contradiction to the narrative Chloe had so carefully crafted for the last 2 years. The narrative of a helpless man lost in the wrong of a post-stroke decline. Tea? He asked, his voice calm, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. I could only nod, my own voice having deserted me. He placed a tea bag in each mug, his focus absolute. As the kettle began to whistle, he turned his chair to face me fully. The man before me was not the vacant invalid I thought I knew. His eyes were sharp, his posture, even while seated, was alert. I imagine you have questions, Eleanor. I finally found my voice, though it came out as a whisper. Arthur, what is going on? Chloe said, she said you could barely speak, that you didn't understand. He let out a humorless chuckle as he poured the hot water into our mugs. What's happening is that I've been playing a role for the past 2 years, he said, his voice dropping to a serious, confidential tone. The role of a declining old man. He pushed a mug across the counter toward me. I'm sorry to have deceived you, but believe me, it was the only way to stay alive in this house. Alive? The word sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the winter air outside. He saw the alarm in my face and nodded grimly. It started subtly, Monday, he began. About 2 years ago, not long after my dear Margaret passed, I started noticing things. A few of my heart medication pills missing from the bottle at the end of the week. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to make me feel off. Then I saw a charge on my bank statement for a store I'd never visited. When I asked Chloe, she just smiled and patted my hand, saying I must have forgotten. He directed me back to the living room. From a hidden compartment in the side of his wheelchair, he pulled out a thick manila folder and placed it on the coffee table. He opened it, revealing a meticulously organized collection of papers, bank statements covered in highlighted marks, handwritten notes on legal pads, and a stack of photographs. It was a dossier of deception. I knew then that I was in trouble, he continued, his finger tracing a line on one of the statements. So I started to play along. I let her believe the stroke had affected my mind more than it had. I became quiet, compliant, and I started to watch. His story tumbled out, a 2-year chronicle of silent observation. The turning point, he explained, came when he overheard Chloe on the phone in the garden. He had been sitting by the window, supposedly asleep. He heard her talking to someone, her voice a syrupy blend of fake sympathy and steel. She was discussing his life expectancy, wondering how long it would be before she could move him into the Whispering Pines nursing facility. She said my decline was accelerating, Arthur recalled, his jaw tight. She was planning my future, or rather, the end of it. From the folder, he produced a photocopied document. It was an information packet from that very facility. Tucked inside was a form Chloe had partially filled out. In the section for patient condition, she had written, severe cognitive decline, prone to confusion and memory loss, unable to manage personal affairs or finances. The clinical, detached words made my stomach churn. She is not my daughter, Eleanor, Arthur clarified, as if sensing my next question. She is Margaret's daughter. When Margaret passed, this house and all of our assets were left to me. Chloe feels entitled to it. She believes it's her birthright, and I am simply an obstacle. The evidence was damning. He showed me the bank statements, a timeline of escalating theft. It started with a few $100s a month, disguised as groceries or household repairs. Then it became thousands. Luxury spa treatments, designer clothing, weekend getaways for her and Ethan, all funded from Arthur's retirement accounts. He had been documenting it all, cross-referencing every withdrawal with his own meticulous notes of her whereabouts. She has manipulated everyone, he said, his voice laced with a quiet fury. She convinced your son that I was a lost cause, a burden he needed her help to manage. She primed my doctors before every visit, telling them I was having a bad day, so they would interpret my silence as a symptom of my condition. He looked at me then, and for the first time, I saw the profound loneliness and exhaustion behind his iron resolve. The weight of his 2-year performance was etched on his face. Do you know what it's like to watch someone slowly steal your life while everyone around you believes you're too far gone as to notice? He asked, his voice cracking with emotion. To have to pretend you don't understand the insults or the lies? To sit in silence as the person you are is erased, piece by piece? The question hung in the air, a devastating testament to his silent suffering. His question hung in the room, heavy and unanswered. I sank onto the sofa opposite him, the untouched mug of tea forgotten on the table. The scope of Chloe's cruelty was staggering, but the reality was far worse than I could have imagined. Arthur seemed to read the turmoil in my mind. The financial theft was only part of it, he said, his voice low and steady. It was the means to an end. The real goal was to control me completely, to make her narrative of my incompetence a reality. He explained that about a year ago, Chloe had gone to his doctor alone. She had tearfully described his supposed agitation at night, his wandering, his confusion. She convinced the doctor, a kind man who had only ever seen Arthur in his silent, passive state, to prescribe a mild sleep aid to help him rest. Arthur knew about the prescription, but what he discovered later was chilling. Chloe had been getting the prescription refilled at twice the normal rate. She was secretly doubling his dose each night, crushing the extra pill into his evening tea. It kept me foggy, Arthur explained, his eyes dark with the memory. It made it harder to think, harder to focus. I felt like I was swimming through mud. It was her way of ensuring I remained compliant, that I couldn't fight back even if I wanted to. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't just greed. This was systematic, calculated abuse. It was fraud, elder abuse, and a slow, insidious form of attempted murder. And my son, Ethan, had stood by and let it happen. He had watched her do this, believing her lies, or worse, choosing to ignore the truth. We have to call the police, Arthur, I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. I reached for my phone, my fingers fumbling. This is a crime, multiple crimes, Arthur held up on and stopping me. And what would we tell them, Eleanor? He asked, his tone patient but firm. Think about it. They'll see an elderly man, one who has been documented by his own doctor as having severe cognitive decline, making wild accusations against his devoted, caregiving stepdaughter. They'll see you, his son's mother, naturally siding with this confused old man. Chloe has spent 2 years building her case. She has medical records, neighbor testimonies she has carefully curated, even your son's support. They'll assume it's paranoid delusions, a symptom of my condition. They will pat her on the shoulder and tell her she's doing a great job under difficult circumstances. He was right. A cold dread washed over me. His own brilliant strategy, pretending to be incompetent to gather evidence, had made him an utterly unreliable witness in the eyes of the law. His proof could be dismissed as the obsessive ramblings of a failing mind. Chloe had trapped him, using his own silence as the bars of his cage. We were powerless. But there's something else, Arthur said, his gaze intensifying. Something I found just last week. It's the reason they took this trip to Italy so suddenly. He leaned down and from the same hidden compartment, he pulled out a second folder, this one even thicker than the first. He placed it on the table between us. My heart hammered against my ribs. What could possibly be worse than what he had already told me? With deliberate, almost ceremonial slowness, he opened the folder. The first page was a letter on official letterhead from the Whispering Pines nursing facility. It was an admission confirmation for one Arthur Vance, with a check-in date of January 15th. So that was her endgame. Once she had full control of his finances, she would have him put away, out of sight and out of mind. But as my eyes scanned further, I saw it. Beneath the letter was another official-looking document. It took me a moment to process the formal heading, the typed information, the official seal at the bottom. It was a death certificate, and the name printed in the center was his, Arthur Vance. The date of death listed was December 26th, 3 days from now. I stared at it, my blood turning to ice. It was a forgery, obviously, but a disturbingly professional one. "What is this?" I whispered, unable to look away from the date. "It's what they're expecting to find when they return from Italy," Arthur stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Or rather, it's the paperwork they expect will be filed." He finally laid out the final monstrous piece of their plan. I heard them talking. They thought I was asleep. Chloe was complaining that the nursing home was taking too long, that my finances were getting complicated to manage. Ethan, your son, agreed. A fresh wave of pain hit me. The plan is simple. Tonight or tomorrow night, the door will be left unlocked. The confused old man with dementia wanders out into the freezing cold. With the sedatives in my system and my weak heart, I suffer a fatal heart attack, a tragic accident, and they have the perfect alibi, a romantic Christmas trip to Italy, thousands of miles away. I looked from the fake death certificate to the calm, resolute man in front of me. The note on his wheelchair, the unlocked door, the sudden trip, it all made a terrible, perfect sense. "This is premeditated murder," I whispered, the words tasting like poison in my mouth. My mind struggled to catch up with the monstrous reality laid out before me. The fake death certificate seemed to radiate a palpable cold. "How, Arthur?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "How can you possibly know all of this? The conversations, their exact plan. It's insane." "Because I have been documenting everything," he said, his calmness a stark contrast to my rising panic. He gestured around the elegantly decorated living room. "There is a recording device in this room behind the bookshelf. There's another in the kitchen, one in the den, one in their master bedroom, and two more that I move around as needed. I have been recording their conversations for the past 8 months, Eleanor. Every word." He reached into the second folder and pulled out a sheaf of papers. They were transcripts, neatly typed and dated. He handed one to me. My eyes scanned the page, my own son's name appearing next to callous, calculating dialogue. I read fragments of their discussions about my son's concerns over the timing, Chloe's reassurances, talk of Arthur's life insurance policies, and a chillingly casual debate about the best time to let the accident happen. It was all there, in black and white. "The death certificate was the final piece," Arthur continued, tapping the document. "Chloe has a friend from college who works in the county records department. A small bribe was all it took to get a convincing forgery. The sheer audacity of their plan, the meticulous evil of it, left me breathless. But Arthur's evidence, while overwhelming to me, still felt fragile against the wall of deceit Chloe had built. "This is proof, Arthur. Undeniable proof," I insisted, my resolve returning. "Forget what you said before. With this, the police have to listen." "And who do they listen to?" he countered, his voice still frustratingly level. "A man who, according to medical science and his doting family, doesn't have the mental capacity to operate a toaster, let alone a network of surveillance devices. They will see these transcripts as a fantasy, the product of a paranoid mind. They will thank us for our time and call my doctor. No, Eleanor, a direct confrontation is a losing battle." He paused, and a new steely light entered his eyes. He leaned forward, and for the first time his voice held a dramatic weight. "That is why they cannot know who I really am." I stared at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" "I'm not just Arthur Garrett, confused stepfather," he said, his voice dropping an octave, each word landing with the force of a hammer blow. "I'm Arthur Garrett, retired private investigator with 42 years of experience." And then he did the impossible. He placed his hands firmly on the armrests of the wheelchair. He pushed himself up, his legs straightening beneath him. He stood. He stood there tall and steady, in the middle of the living room. He took a deliberate step toward me, then another. The blanket fell from his lap to the floor. The wheelchair, the symbol of his helplessness, sat empty behind him. A gasp escaped my lips. I felt as if the world had tilted on its axis. The stroke I had 2 years ago was real, he explained, his voice now crisp and authoritative, the voice of a man accustomed to being in charge. But it was minor. The physical effects were gone in a month. The cognitive effects a few weeks after that. I was lucky. But when I overheard Chloe's first phone call about my finances, I realized my prolonged recovery could be the perfect cover. So I committed to it. He walked over to the fireplace, his stride confident and sure. He ran a hand over the mantelpiece, his back straight. This entire persona, the shaking hands, the slurred speech, the vacant stare, it's all been an act, an investigation. The wheelchair is a prop. I've been secretly swapping out the double doses of sedatives Chloe gives me with placebos. I take my actual heart medication from a private stash she knows nothing about. I am in perfect health. My mind reeled, trying to absorb the enormity of his deception. He had been a prisoner in his own home, but he had also been the warden, silently observing, gathering evidence, waiting for the perfect moment. He turned back to face me, his expression intense. I couldn't move until I had everything, until I understood the full scope of their plan. But I was missing one crucial element. I needed an unimpeachable witness, someone they would never suspect, someone they themselves had put in a position of trust. His eyes locked onto mine. I'm sorry to drag you into this, Eleanor, but your Christmas visit wasn't a coincidence. I subtly planted the idea with Ethan weeks ago. I needed you here. He stood before me, no longer a victim, but a strategist, a hunter waiting to spring his trap. Everything I thought I knew had been a lie, but it was a lie in the service of a profound truth. He took a step closer, his gaze searching my face. Do you believe me, Eleanor? He asked intently. I looked at the empty wheelchair, at the mountain of evidence, at the sharp, intelligent man standing before me. There was only one possible answer. Yes, I said, my voice clear and firm. I do. What he told me next was the most audacious, terrifying plan I had ever heard. If you're as gripped by my story as I was in that moment, make sure you are following along. Like and share so others can hear it too, because you will not believe what we did next. My affirmation hung in the air, a silent vow that shifted the atmosphere of the room from one of horrified discovery to one of tense conspiracy. Arthur gave a single, sharp nod, accepting my allegiance. He began to pace the length of the living room, his movements fluid and charged with a restless energy that had been suppressed for 2 long years. The empty wheelchair stood like a shed snakeskin, a testament to the man who had been hiding in plain sight. Good, he said, his voice now that of a field general laying out a battle plan. Because we are not going to the police. We are not going to a lawyer. We are going to finish this, right here. He stopped and turned to face me, his eyes burning with an intensity that was both thrilling and terrifying. We're going to give them exactly what they want, Eleanor. We're going to let them come home from their celebratory trip and find Arthur Garrett dead. I recoiled as if struck. What? Arthur, no, that's insane. It's the only way, he countered, cutting through my protest. Their plan is our blueprint. We will stage my death precisely as they envisioned it. The confused old man wandering out into the cold, a tragic accident. You will be the one to find me. You will make the frantic call. You will play the part of the grieving, shocked mother-in-law. He resumed his pacing, thinking aloud. When they get the news and come rushing back, they will walk into this house believing they have succeeded. They will be unguarded, they will talk, and my recorders will be listening to every self-incriminating word, every sigh of relief, every discussion of the money they are about to inherit. He paused in front of the cold fireplace, a grim smile playing on his lips. And then, he said, his voice dropping to a dramatic whisper, we're going to bring Arthur Garrett back from the dead. The image was so audacious, so theatrical. It was brilliant. It was a trap built not of steel and wire, but of their own greed and arrogance. It was perfect, but the danger was real. Arthur's expression sobered as he looked at me. We have 3 days, Eleanor. 3 days to prepare every detail. The timing of your discovery, The call you make, what you say to the authorities, everything must be flawless. They are expecting a tragedy on December 26th. We cannot disappoint them. One mistake, one slip of the tongue, and this all falls apart. At best, they get away with everything. At worst, he let the unspoken threat hang in the air. It could be fatal for me, for real this time. He walked over and stood directly in front of me, his gaze unwavering. He was no longer asking me to believe him. He was asking me to trust him with his life. Are you with me, Eleanor? Because once we start this, there's no going back. You will be lying to your own son, to the police, to everyone. It's a heavy burden. I looked at this incredible man who had endured 2 years of humiliation and isolation, who had feigned dementia to protect himself and uncover the truth. I thought of my son, Ethan, and the man he had become, a willing accomplice to such monstrous cruelty. The choice was not a choice at all. It was a moral imperative. I'm with you, Arthur, I said, my voice steady. Tell me what I need to do. The next morning, Christmas Eve, the house felt like a command center. Arthur was a completely different person, focused, meticulous, and tireless. He coached me for hours. The discovery needs to be in the backyard near the frozen bird bath, he instructed, pointing out the window. It's visible from the kitchen, but not from the street, a plausible place for me to have fallen. He then pulled out a copy of his most recent medical records, which he'd obtained through a friend. Chloe has online access to these, he explained, showing me a cardiologist's report. She made sure my doctor documented my mild arrhythmia and sensitivity to cold. She thought she was building a foundation for her story. Instead, she handed us the perfect, believable cause of death. A man with a known heart condition succumbs to the freezing temperatures. No one will question it. We spent the day rehearsing. He drilled me on the script for my call to emergency services, teaching me how to inject the right amount of panic and grief into my voice. We walked through the timeline again and again, ensuring every detail was accounted for. As the sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the snow-covered lawn, we stood together by the window, looking out at the spot where his body would be found. A strange calm had settled over me. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a powerful sense of purpose. They've thought of almost everything, Arthur said quietly, more to himself than to me. The medical history, the alibi, the manipulation of friends and family. It's a very thorough plan. He turned from the window, a flicker of something like admiration for their cunning in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by cold resolve. But they made one critical error. They assumed I was too far gone to notice. The entire house is a stage, Eleanor, Arthur explained the next day, which was Christmas. While the world outside was celebrating, we were preparing for a grim performance. But the microphones are the heart of the operation. He walked me through the house, pointing out the precise locations of the tiny, nearly invisible listening devices. One was tucked into the back of a faux leather-bound book on the living room shelf. Another was concealed within the range hood over the stove in the kitchen. The most audacious ones were in their master bedroom, hidden in a smoke detector, and in the study, nestled inside an old desk lamp. Every room where they might feel safe enough to have a private conversation, he said. But will they? I asked, a knot of doubt tightening in my stomach. Won't they be careful, even if they think you're gone? Arthur stopped and then looked at me, a flicker of a smile on his face. Trust me, they will confess, he said with absolute certainty. Their relief will make them careless. Their greed will make them boast. And Chloe, he paused. Chloe can't resist gloating when she thinks she's won. Her ego will be our greatest asset. He then led me to a narrow door in the back of a linen closet. It opened onto a dark, steep set of stairs leading down to a crawl space. This is where I'll be, he said, flicking on a bare bulb that illuminated a small, surprisingly well-equipped setup. A comfortable chair, a small table with a laptop, headphones, and a complex array of audio receivers were neatly arranged. From here, I can monitor and record everything from all 6 channels. I'll have food, water, and everything I need to stay hidden for as long as it takes. It was his secret theater from which he would direct the final act. Your role, he continued, turning back to me, his tone all business, is to be the innocent family member who discovered the tragedy. You are devastated. You are in shock. You are grieving the loss of the man you were just getting to know. You must be completely convincing. He handed me a few folded sheets of paper. On them, he had written out a detailed script. It included a word-for-word guide for my call to 911, with notes in the margins like pause here, take a shaky breath, and voice should crack on this word. It also included branching dialogue options for my subsequent phone call to Chloe and Ethan in Italy. He'd thought of everything. He even revealed he had a trusted contact, an old friend from his investigator days who now ran a funeral home. He's in on it, Arthur explained. He will handle the arrangements with the authorities. He will ensure an official record of my death is created and that my cremation is scheduled. It needs to be airtight. That evening, as darkness fell, we went out into the snow-covered backyard to rehearse. The air was frigid, my breath pluming in front of me. Arthur, dressed in a thick coat, lay down in the snow near the bird bath. "Okay, Eleanor," he said, his voice muffled by the scarf around his face. "You're in the kitchen, making tea. You glance out the window. Now, go." I ran through the scene, my heart pounding despite the fact it was only a drill. I rushed out, my feet sinking into the snow. I knelt beside him, checking for a pulse I knew was there. I practiced my scream, the sound swallowed by the silent, snowy night. We did it 3 times until he was satisfied with my performance. Back inside, warming our hands by the fire, a final heavy silence settled between us. Arthur seemed to sense my lingering fear. "There's one last thing you need to know," he said, his voice soft. He led me to a study and pointed to a large framed photograph of his late wife, Margaret. He carefully removed it from the wall, revealing a hidden safe. "Chloe knows about this safe, but she thinks it's empty. She doesn't have the combination." He spun the dial with practiced ease. Inside was not just paperwork, but stacks of cash, bonds, and deeds to properties. There's over $300,000 in assets here that she knows nothing about. It was mine and Margaret's emergency fund. He closed the safe and replaced the picture. "This is my insurance policy. In this safe, along with the assets, is a sealed package for my lawyer with copies of all my evidence and a full written confession of my investigation. If something goes wrong with our plan, if they get to me before I can expose them, this will ensure they are still brought to justice." The weight of that responsibility, of that final grim possibility, settled on me. "Arthur," I whispered, "are you sure? We could still call the police. We could give them all of this." "No, Eleanor," he said, his voice firm, resolute. "It's not enough to have them arrested. They need to be caught. They need to be exposed in the act of celebrating my death. The world needs to hear their guilt in their own voices." He looked toward the calendar on the wall, where December 26th was circled in red. "Tomorrow night, Arthur Garrett dies." The days between Christmas and their return were the longest of my life. The house was a silent tomb, but I was not alone. Down in the crawl space, Arthur monitored his equipment, a ghost in his own home. My performance on December 26th had gone exactly as planned. The paramedics had been kind and sympathetic. The police officer had taken my statement with gentle professionalism. Arthur's friend from the funeral home had played his part with solemn grace. As far as the world was concerned, Arthur Garrett was deceased, another unfortunate victim of a cold snap and a weak heart. On the afternoon of December 29th, my nerves were stretched to their breaking point. I sat in the living room, a book open on my lap, though I hadn't read a single word. Every passing car on the street made me jump. Finally, at exactly 2:15, a taxi pulled into the driveway. The curtain had risen. It was time for the final act. I watched through the window as Ethan and Chloe emerged, looking tanned, rested, and carefree. They laughed as Ethan paid the driver, their suitcases looking oddly festive, covered in colorful airline tags from Rome. The sight of my son, so relaxed and happy just days after orchestrating a man's death, broke something deep inside me. I opened the door before they could ring the bell. I had been rehearsing this moment for days, but as I looked into my son's eyes, the tears that filled mine were completely genuine. They were not for the man hiding in the basement, but for the son I had lost, the kind, compassionate boy who had vanished and been replaced by this smiling monster. Chloe's smile faded first, replaced by a mask of concern. "Eleanor, what is it? What's wrong?" Ethan looked at me, his own expression clouding with a carefully practiced worry. I let out a shuddering breath, just as Arthur had coached me. I clutched my hands together, letting them tremble slightly. "It's Arthur," I whispered, my voice thick with unshed tears. "He's gone." I let the words hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final devastating blow. "He died on Christmas morning." I watched their faces closely. It was a flicker, so fast that anyone else would have missed it. But I saw it. Beneath the immediate performance of shock and horror, a flash of pure, unadulterated relief passed between them. It was the look of two people who had just realized their terrible gamble had paid off. Their plan had worked. Chloe was the first to rush forward, wrapping me in a cold, theatrical embrace. "Oh, Eleanor, no! How? What happened?" she cried, her voice a perfect imitation of grief. I allowed myself to be led to the sofa where I recited the script Arthur and I had perfected. "I found him in the backyard," I choked out, dabbing at my eyes with a tissue. "He must have wandered out in the night. The paramedics, they said it was his heart because of the cold. They said with his condition, there was no need for an autopsy. It was peaceful." Ethan knelt before me, taking my hands in his. His were warm from the Italian sun. Mine were ice cold. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I can't believe it. We should have been here." "There's nothing we could have done," Chloe said, stroking my back. The irony of her using the exact words Arthur had predicted was chilling. "You know how he was. It was a tragic accident. That's all." Later that evening, after the initial storm of feigned grief had passed, I excused myself to go to the bathroom. I left the door slightly ajar, ran the water in the sink, and stood perfectly still, listening. I knew they believed they were finally alone, finally safe. The house was listening with me. Chloe's voice, now stripped of its syrupy sympathy, drifted down the hall. It was crisp, triumphant. "Can you believe how perfectly this worked out?" she said, her voice low but clear. "No police questions, no autopsy. Your mother is the perfect witness." "I know," Ethan replied, his voice a mixture of relief and lingering unease. "It almost feels too easy." "It was easy because I was smart," Chloe snapped back, a note of pride in her voice. "All those months of telling people how confused he was, of drugging his tea just enough to keep him docile. I set the stage and nature took care of the rest." It was a full confession, delivered with chilling arrogance. They went on to discuss the will, which Chloe had already seen. They talked about the value of the house, $400,000 Chloe estimated, and their plans to sell it quickly. They celebrated the fact that my presence, the presence of an innocent, grieving family member, gave their story complete credibility. When I returned, Chloe was all smiles and sympathy again. She put her arm around me. "Eleanor, you've been so brave through all of this. Please stay for a few more days. We need you here. It would help us to have you here while we make the arrangements." She wanted to keep her perfect witness close to manage me to ensure the story held. I looked at her, at my son, and I felt a cold, hard resolve settle in my heart. "Of course, dear," I said, my voice soft. "I'll stay as long as you need me." January 2nd dawned gray and cold, a fitting backdrop for a funeral. Arthur's friend at the funeral home had arranged everything with remarkable efficiency. The small chapel was respectfully filled with friends, neighbors, and old colleagues of Arthur's, all of whom had been told the tragic news of his sudden passing. They had come to pay their respects to a man they believed was gone, their faces etched with sincere sadness. At the front of the chapel, a handsome oak casket rested, closed, surrounded by wreaths of lilies and roses. It was, of course, completely empty. I sat in the front pew, a black veil partially obscuring my face. On my right, Chloe dabbed at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, a perfect portrait of a devoted, heartbroken stepdaughter. On my left, my son Ethan stared blankly at the casket, his face pale and drawn. They were performing their roles brilliantly for the assembled audience. They had no idea that the real audience, the man this was all for, was watching them from the very back row. Arthur had slipped in just before the service began, disguised in a tweed overcoat, a flat cap pulled low over his forehead, and a surprisingly convincing salt and pepper beard. He looked like just another elderly acquaintance, lost in the crowd of mourners. The service was a masterclass in hypocrisy. Several of Arthur's old friends got up to share fond, genuine memories of a vibrant, intelligent man, and with each heartfelt tribute, I could feel Chloe and Ethan shifting uncomfortably beside me. They were being confronted with the reality of the man they had tried to erase, and it was clear they just wanted the ordeal to be over. Finally, it was Chloe's turn to deliver the eulogy. She glided to the podium, her movements practiced and somber. She took a deep, shaky breath, clutching a piece of paper that I knew contained her carefully crafted lies. She began to speak, her voice thick with manufactured emotion. She spoke of Arthur's kindness after her mother passed away, of his gentle spirit. Then she moved on to the last 2 years. It was an honor to care for him in his final years, she said, her voice cracking. To be there for him as his health declined was a privilege. Some might see it as a difficult task, but I want you all to know, she paused, looking out at the crowd, her eyes shining with fake tears. Arthur was never a burden. He was a blessing, and the unconditional love I felt for him made every moment precious. The sickening sweetness of her words, the sheer, unadulterated gall of her performance, made me want to scream. I gripped my purse so tightly my knuckles turned white. She concluded her speech and returned to the pew, accepting Ethan's comforting arm around her shoulders. The pastor stepped up to offer a final prayer and conclude the service. He was just about to ask the congregation to bow their heads when a clear, strong voice echoed from the back of the chapel. "Excuse me, I have something to say." A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. Heads turned. Chloe and Ethan stiffened beside me. The pastor paused, looking uncertainly toward the back. And then he started walking. The figure in the tweed coat and flat cap began to move slowly, deliberately, down the central aisle. As he walked, he reached up and pulled off the cap. Then with his other hand, he peeled away the fake beard, revealing the familiar, resolute face of Arthur Garrett. A collective gasp swept through the chapel. People half rose from their seats, murmuring in disbelief. I turned to look at Chloe. All the color had drained from her face, replaced by a ghastly, waxy pallor. Her mouth hung open in a silent scream. Ethan looked as if he had seen a ghost, his eyes wide with pure, uncomprehending terror. Arthur reached the front and stepped up onto the dais, standing beside his own empty casket. He looked out at the sea of stunned faces, his gaze finally settling on Chloe. A grim, triumphant smile touched his lips. "It's not every day a man gets to hear his own eulogy," he announced, his voice booming in the suddenly silent chapel. "And I must say, Chloe, yours was a truly remarkable performance." He turned his attention to the crowd, his expression hardening. "I apologize for the deception," he said, his voice ringing with authority, "but I wanted you all to be here. I wanted you to be witnesses." He pointed a finger directly at Chloe, who looked as though she was about to collapse. "This woman, my stepdaughter, did not love me. She did not honor me. My stepdaughter Chloe, with the help of her husband, my son-in-law Ethan, has been systematically poisoning me, stealing my money, and planning my murder for the past 2 years. The chapel erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps and frantic whispers. Arthur's accusation hung in the air, electric and undeniable. Before anyone could process the shock, he reached into his coat pocket and produced a small, black digital recorder. He held it up for everyone to see. "You don't have to take my word for it," he announced, his voice cutting through the noise. "Why don't we let Chloe tell you herself?" He pressed a button. A moment of static filled the chapel, and then Chloe's voice. Not the tearful, grieving voice from the eulogy, but a cold, triumphant one, echoed from the small device. "Can you believe how perfectly this worked out?" The sound was crystal clear, amplified by the chapel's acoustics. The entire congregation fell silent, listening in horrified fascination. Then came the most damning part. The beauty of psychological manipulation is that you can make people do exactly what you want. All those months of drugging his tea just enough to keep him docile. I set the stage, and nature took care of the rest. As her recorded voice faded, the main doors of the chapel swung open. 2 uniformed police officers stepped inside, their presence immediately commanding the room. They were led by a man in a detective suit, whom I later learned was Detective Morrison, an old colleague Arthur had briefed on the entire case. Chloe finally found her voice, a high-pitched, hysterical shriek. Lies! It's a trick! He's a crazy old man! The detective ignored her, taking the recorder from Arthur. He played another segment for the room to hear, this time the conversation about the $400,000 house and how my presence as their witness gave them complete credibility. This is a setup, Chloe screamed, lunging toward Arthur, but Ethan, looking like a statue carved from ash, grabbed her arm and held her back. He's been faking it all. He tricked all of you. Arthur looked at her, his expression not of anger, but of profound pity. You're right about one thing, Chloe, he said calmly, his voice resonating with moral authority. I did engage in deception, but my deception was designed to save my life. Yours was designed to commit murder. That single sentence silenced her. It was the undeniable truth, and it settled over the room with the weight of a final judgment. Detective Morrison stepped forward. Chloe Vance, Ethan Miller, he said, his voice formal and firm. You are under arrest for a conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, and financial fraud. The officers moved in, clicking handcuffs onto their wrists. The sound was sharp and final in the quiet chapel. My son didn't resist. He simply stared at the floor, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat. But Chloe fought. As one of the officers restrained her, she twisted her head and her eyes, filled with pure venom, locked onto mine. You, she spat, the word dripping with hatred. You knew. You helped him. I stood up, meeting her gaze without flinching. All the pain, all the betrayal I felt for my son and this woman coalesced into a single, quiet statement of fact. I knew you were trying to kill a good man for money, I replied, and I helped him stop you. A flicker of shock crossed her face before the officers led them both away, past the stunned faces of their friends and neighbors. An hour later, the chapel was empty. The mourners had dispersed, the police had gone, and the empty casket had been discreetly removed. Only Arthur and I remained, sitting together in the front pew. The silence was a welcome relief. They will be convicted, Arthur said, breaking the quiet. The recordings, the financial records, the forged death certificate, they have no defense. They will face long prison sentences. He turned to me, his face etched with a weariness that his triumphant return had masked. Eleanor, I have to ask you to forgive me. I put you in an impossible position. I put you in danger. I looked at this man who had fought his way back from the brink, using his brilliant mind as his only weapon. There's nothing to forgive, Arthur, I told him, and I meant it. You gave me the chance to stand up for what was right, even when it was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. 6 months have passed since that day. I received a letter yesterday, postmarked from a sunny town in Florida. Arthur sold the house and moved south, finally able to enjoy the retirement he so richly deserved. His letter was full of news. As he predicted, the trial was swift. Chloe was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Ethan, for his role, received 8. I have not seen my son, and I don't know if I ever will. Arthur and I have become unlikely friends, two people bonded by a shared, traumatic fight for justice. We write to each other every week. His last letter ended with a line that made me smile through a fresh wave of tears. Thank you, he wrote, for believing in a dead man's story. It made all the difference in helping him come back to life.